There's a soldier's uniform that hangs in my closet. It's not mine. It belonged to my dad. My dad was in World War II, and he was a member of the U.S. Air Force. Dad was a senior in college. He was almost done. He was this close to graduating at the University of Wisconsin, when Uncle Sam called him up and said, "We need you to help fight the Nazis in Germany." And so, Dad became a member of a B-24 crew that fought the Nazis. On his uniform, on one collar is a silver bar, and that designates his rank, which was lieutenant. On another collar, it's got his wings, showing that he was a member of the Air Force. At its center, a big brass propeller. There's a patch on one sleeve that's a big blue patch showing that he was a member of the mighty 8th Air Force. You see, it was the 8th Air Force that flew all the bombing missions into Germany late in the war, before we finally defeated Germany. And those missions were incredibly dangerous. It was one thing to bomb the French coast during D-Day, because it was so close to England. And they could make their bomb runs and get back to England in a matter of hours and be safe. But flying deep into Germany, they were exposed for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And they were shot at by the German Luftwaffe fighter planes and by the flak guns. And it took a terrible toll on them. Marines and Army members had a much better percentage chance of going home alive after their war than did members of the bomber crews. Members of the bomber crew had to serve 30 missions, after which time they could go back home to the U.S. Problem is, almost nobody survived 30 missions. They almost all died. So it was a very dangerous area to be in. As a member of a B-24 crew, there were, I don't know how many people on the plane, 12 or so. There were 2 waist gunners, there was a tail gunner, there was a belly gunner, there was a nose gunner, there was the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, and they all had to know how to do each other's jobs. Because if your right waist gunner was killed during the mission, then somebody else could jump in and take over that machine gun to help provide protection for the plane from being attacked from that side. So as a result, their crew all went together to gunnery school in Texas, and then a navigation school in New Mexico. And they all learned how to fill in for each other if they had to on a mission, which happened quite often. And then at one point, of all places, my dad, from Madison, Wisconsin, ended up in Mountain Home, Idaho, at the Air Force Base there for some training. And when he heard about it, he was really excited. He thought, "Oh man, I'm finally going to get to see the Rocky Mountains." Well, imagine his disappointment when he got to Mountain Home and saw sagebrush and flats and desert. It wasn't quite what he was hoping for. But while he was in Mountain Home, my mom took a train out to Boise, and they were married in Boise at St. John's Cathedral on Hayes Street in the north end of Boise. Why do I tell you about that? Well, many, many years later, I was a TV director in San Luis Obispo, California, and then I got an offer to come to work for KTVB Channel 7 and direct newscasts at Channel 7. When I moved to Boise, it wasn't too long after that I met my wife-to-be. And where did she live? 3 doors down from that cathedral. You know, when you think about it, life has a pretty good sense of humor sometimes. But let's go back to 1944. This is a B-24. This is the kind of plane my dad flew in. You could always tell it by that big H-shaped tail. It was what was called a heavy bomber. And there were really only 2 heavy bombers in the war. The Flying Fortress, which was more famous, the B-17, and the Liberator, or the B-24. These were planes that could hold thousands of tons of bombs and fly them hundreds of miles deep into Germany, release them, and their targets were the factories where the German war-making machine resided. In other words, they were trying to knock out factories where the Germans assembled their planes, their tanks, their destroyers, their battleships, their submarines, as well as oil depots, gas depots, trains that carried munitions to the front lines for the soldiers. They were trying to break down the ability of the Germans to wage war. They didn't want civilian casualties. And that's what they were trying to do. As they were flying these missions, they were shot at by flak gunners, such as you see here. And on almost every mission, somebody on Dad's plane would get injured or killed. It was really a terrifying sort of thing to go through as a 21-year-old man. To see the people that you had gone through training with in New Mexico and Idaho, and had spent so much time with, bonding with, that you became a real, true band of brothers, as the saying goes. To see those people either killed outright or bleed to death in your plane because of catastrophic injuries, I'm sure it had to be horrific on my dad. But he didn't talk about it very much. We've learned a lot through looking back at his journals, his logs, and the letters that he wrote to his family and the letters that they wrote back to him. But it was a very dangerous occupation. And about the 18th or 19th mission they were on, almost the entire crew was killed, and they had to crash land back in England. My dad survived, a few other guys survived, most of the rest of the guys died. One of the guys that died was the pilot, Leo. And Leo had been my dad's best man at his wedding, and I know that that was terribly difficult on him. Many years later, he went back to Europe. He knelt at Leo's grave, and he wept. And I can only imagine how tough that must have been for him, and yet how moving it must have been for him. So, by the time his 20th mission came along, he was what was called a floater. And he was assigned to work with other crews who needed a bombardier or a navigator. So, on his 20th mission, he's riding with these guys that he really doesn't even know. They're a bunch of strangers to him. It's not like this camaraderie, this brotherhood that they had with the initial crew. They're strangers to him. And their target for that day was Hamburg. Well, American flyers hated going to Hamburg because Hamburg was the only seaport in the country of Germany. So obviously, they made and launched all their battleships, destroyers, and submarines in Hamburg. So obviously, it was well fortified. It was protected with flak guns like this, and with buildings like this, which actually was from Hamburg, and which had 4 corners, each one of which had these huge flak guns. And each one of those 4 flak guns could shoot 4 miles into the air. 4 miles! Now a B-24 couldn't fly above 4 miles. So it couldn't fly above these shells. And the shells were made of steel, and they had explosives inside. And the gunners could set them so that they would explode at a certain elevation. So they would try to dial it in and figure out what the elevation of the planes was so that they could hit them. And as the shells exploded, the metal came apart and it became spinning shards of steel that went through the tin, the aluminum of American bomber planes like a can opener through a can of tuna fish. what it did to flesh and bone was beyond horrific. That's what they had to face that day. And furthermore, they had volunteered to be the lead plane. So just like you see geese flying a V with a lead bird, the formations of bombers flew in a V, and there was a lead plane. Now, why in the world would you volunteer to be the lead plane? Because the Germans always tried to hit that first, thinking it was going to confuse the rest of the planes and set them into panic mode, and then they'd be easier to pick off if they weren't flying in formation. But the reason they volunteered for that is because if you serve on a lead plane, you could go home after 25 missions, and this was their 20th mission. So if they survived this one, oh boy, 5 more missions and they could go home, rather than like most people having to get to 30 missions, which rarely happened. And it was while they were on their run over Hamburg that they were hit by flak. Now this is not their plane. I don't have a picture of their plane after it was hit, but it was severely damaged. And you can see from this photo evidence of what flak does to an aluminum bomber. It's devastating. So they knew one thing immediately. There was no way they could fly this crippled bomber back all the way to England and land at their base. No way. It was damaged way too much. So they had to figure out what to do. So what they did is they took a short hop across the Baltic Ocean, the Baltic Sea rather, and flew into the southern tip of Sweden. Sweden was a neutral country. It didn't support the Nazis and it didn't support the Allies. And as weird or bizarre as it may sound, there are actually rules for neutral countries in a war. To maintain their neutral status, if they got, whether they got a Nazi airplane crew or an American airplane crew, they had to keep them there for the duration of the war. If they let them go home again, the Nazis could say, hey, you're aiding our combatants, you're aiding the other side, so we're going to invade Sweden. We're going to take Sweden over just like we did Norway. Sweden didn't want that to happen, so they kept all the people there. They had to crash land on a small airstrip, and as they crash landed, the co-pilot broke his back, and the next day he died. But the rest of the guys survived. And they got off the plane, the Swedish authorities were there, met them with drawn weapons, but for Dad and the rest of the crew, their war was over. Now, when you think about this, you might be envisioning him being in a prisoner of war camp, but it really wasn't that way. Because they were a neutral country, they didn't have prisoner of war camps. What they had was an old hotel. And flyers got to stay at this old hotel. They were even allowed on weekends to go into town and watch Hollywood movies at theaters. So it wasn't that shabby. But now imagine how difficult this was on my mother. She was told that her husband was missing in action in World War II. And she's wondering, is he alive or dead? And then finally the Swedes allow them to send home a telegram. And Dad's was just 3 words, "Am alive, Carl." And I'm sure my mom was happy to hear that, but I'm sure she wanted more information. So then after a while more, they decided they would let the flyers send home photos of themselves. And Dad was wearing a sweater that he bought over in Sweden. And, you know, Sweden's up there by the Arctic Circle. They've got really severe winters up there. It's pretty cold. And he bought this sweater and it had reindeer on it. And before they could send out any mail, all the mail had to go through military censors. And the military censors have to look at it. And again, it's kind of crazy to have rules in a war as barbaric as World War II was, but they did. And to maintain their neutral status, They had to make sure that none of the American flyers or the German flyers were sending back any information as to where they were located. Because if they did, the Americans could possibly send in some parachutists to try to rescue them and get them out of Sweden to get them back in the war. And so when they saw this sweater on my dad, they said, wait a second, we can't let that go out because we're the only neutral country in World War II that has reindeer in it. So reindeer on a sweater is telling people back in the US, hey, I'm in Sweden. So the censors took scissors and they cut out my dad's entire body. And my mom gets a picture of him. It's just this floating head. And again, I wonder, which was more difficult? My dad's end of it, being up there every day and every other day at times, risking his life with people shooting at him, trying to kill him, and seeing his buddies die in front of himself. Or my mom's back home, waiting and wondering, is my husband okay? I'm sure she was glad to see his smiling face and his head. I'm sure she wondered, why did they cut out the rest of his body? Is there something wrong? You know, has he been handicapped for life? Has he lost some limbs? What's going on? Luckily, it was only about another 6 months before the Russians plowed into Moscow, took it over. Hitler committed suicide, and shortly thereafter, the Nazis unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. My dad was able to go back to America, where he and my mom had a reunion. They went on to have 5 sons, of which I am one. I look at that uniform, and I think about my dad. And I think about what he went through. And I wonder, could I have had the courage to have gone through that? And I especially think, how did he go through that, come out of that war, a normal, caring, decent person? Because you know what? He loved his wife. He loved his 5 sons. He treated us so well. He cared about us. He provided for us. He helped us when we needed help. And I think if he could go through that experience and come out as sane and as kind and caring as he did, then I have no right to gripe about the relatively small problems I have in my life. We all have problems in life. But I never had people shooting at me when I was 21 years of age trying to kill me. Day after day after day. And so when I look at his uniform hanging in my closet, it reminds me how lucky I am to have had such a great dad. He died over a decade ago. And you know what? I still think about him just about every day of my life. I miss him tremendously. I wish I could ask him questions. I wish I could ask for his advice on how I can be a better husband, and how I can be a better father. And it reminds me that he was not only my dad, he was really my hero. I miss him tremendously, but I'm so grateful that he was my dad. And I can only hope to be as good a dad and a father and a husband as my dad was to me. I hope you enjoyed that story, and thank you for listening.